The only two remarks I will make. One is to spotlight Jane Greer's connection to Beatrice Institute. When I first arrived here in 2021, one of the first people I met was Mike Aquilina, and he and I got coffee and geeked over Bob Dylan and Paul Simon and then poetry. And it became very clear that Beatrice Institute was in a position to do what at the time felt like a dramatic, innovative poetry event. Sam Hazo at the time was 93 years old and had been out of the game for a long time. He had sunset the International Poetry Forum, and we had the idea, well, let's give what we thought was Sam one wild ride, one last time, get him up there. The guy's still alive and reading and publishing. So it wasn't as dramatic a sort of like fanfare as I thought it would be, thank God, because he's published like 12 books since. But the idea was, could we do 2 days of poetry? Would Pittsburgh really be amenable to that kind of thing? And it was. There was a lot of people. We held at the First Baptist Church in Oakland, which is this magnificently neo-Gothic structure. And the reason I bring it up is because it's when I met Jane Greer. Jane Greer was someone that Mike Aquilina had suggested that we invite all the way out from Bismarck to come and read. And Jane had gotten on the phone and said, we'll drive. Jim and I will drive. It's going to be a road trip. I'm so excited. When I was looking for a title for the event, I found a review of Jane's collection written by Sam Hazo, in which he described her poetry as holy slang. And that just hit me. I just thought holy slang was kind of what I wanted to do. This poetry about whiskey and sex and art in a Baptist church. Right? This was holy slang. And it was a marvelous event. And one of the highlights was Jane Greer's wit, Jane Greer's energy, her ability to sort of see to the heart of something in 3 words or less. I really enjoyed the event and really enjoyed getting to know Jane Greer. And so when she reached out to me last year, Mike again and said, hey, Jane wants to do another event. She'll come out to Pittsburgh, and she's got this like wild fantasy for something that's way more fun than just poets reading their own poetry. And I got to talking to Jane, and it was something I thought, well, the only reason we'll be able to pull this off is because A, you own Twitter, and you're gonna be able to promote the heck out of it. And B, I think there will be enough of an appetite. And then tragically, in the middle of those conversations, Jane suddenly passed away last July. And it looked like the event was going to be dead in the water. And reached out to the friends of Jane Greer and to Mike especially again, and it was sort of made clear that no, Beatrice Institute was really in a place where we could do something in memoriam. And instead of just a bunch of, readings or reading Jane's poetry, we would do her fantasy, what she had imagined. And being the inveterate Catholic I am, I feel totally at liberty to say I do think she's like watching over the event and living in the event. And I felt that as we put this together. So I feel very close to Jane Greer. I'm very grateful to our panelists. And I'm very grateful to you all for showing up and enjoying a Tuesday evening, rainy and sunny at the same time. Feels very Jane. And I'll invite Mike up here who will say a few words, and then we'll have Zina, and Zina will introduce the table. Nothing's super academic thorough, and you'll get to know 3 amazing poets, and hopefully hear some things you haven't heard before about Jane Greer. So Mike Aquilina.
Thank you. And thank all of you. It's good to be here tonight with all of you, especially Jane's husband, Jim Luptak. Welcome here to Bismarck, North. He's known to the world as Mr. Wonderful. That's what Jane called him, and eventually she just abbreviated it to Mr. W. So everyone knows him. This morning when we met Zina, she said, Mr. W, she knew who he was. So, and I see that there are fellow travelers of Jane here from her journeys abroad. There are writers who were edited by Jane and managed to live to tell the tale. And there are also the Jane curious, who will surely take her poems forward in literary history. So welcome to all of you. If you knew Jane, or just followed her on Twitter, you know this about her. She spoke with clarity and brevity. She was blunt. Blunt. For her, these qualities were elements of kindness. She knew she wasn't doing anybody any favors by blurring the edges around the truth. So the truth is what she served up, whether in an editorial comment on a manuscript or in the voice of North Dakota Jane on Twitter. There was nothing unfeminine about her bluntness. Hers was the voice of your sister, your mom, your daughter, or your wife, not the young lady who's trying to sell you a car. I have 4 sisters and 5 daughters, and 1 each of mom and wife. So I know how this works. My interaction with Jane went back, I think, to the late 1980s, when I was in my 20s. I was not long out of Penn State, and I had a degree in poetry. I was ready for the world to notice this. Jane was at that moment a known figure in the very small world known as PoBiz. She had just won some awards for her little lit mag, which was formalist and regionalist. So she was getting attention in thinky magazines. And pundits loved to quote from her editorial manifesto. And they said that you could obtain that manifesto in its entirety for the price of a self-addressed stamped envelope. I could not resist that. So I got one. I can't deal with mine. So I got one, and I loved her voice. It was blunt, never unkind, but blunt. So I subscribed to the magazine, and then I began to hunt up Jane's poems, which was no small feat in those days before the World Wide Web. You really had to go hunting. And then I sent her my poems, and I received my very own first blunt communication from Jane, okay? It was not a sheet of paper. It was not a sheet of paper. It was a slip of paper, and it was pink. Who else sends out actual pink slips as their form rejections? Jane did. Well, I threw it away, and I sent her more poems. And then I got this one. Dear Mike, I liked this. Please do send more. Thank you. I mean, it was still a pink slip. And signed Jane. Nice. And then I got this one. Thanks. This comes very close, Jane. So before long, I was getting, and before long after this, I started getting relatively chatty acceptance letters on honest-to-goodness letterhead. This was the life, right? Jane had strong opinions, and she said them out loud. They were defensible, and she was ready to defend them. But she had a love for freedom, and she thought freedom was best expressed in old-fashioned argument. She founded the influential literary magazine Plains Poetry Journal in 1981 and served as its editor until 1993, when she shut it down. The journal has been called an advance guard of the new formalism movement. And I've seen that line in several sources as I prepared this introduction. And there's some truth to that. But it can also leave people with the wrong impression. I would hesitate to identify Jane Greer or her work with any ism. It's true that she promoted a renewed appreciation of the formal elements in poetry, and she was willing to list them off as she did in her editorial manifesto that I got for the price of a self-addressed stamped envelope. Meter, rhyme, alliteration, assonance, and painstaking attention to diction. And it's true that she was not so fond of poems that sounded, she said, like tape-recorded conversation or random thoughts randomly written. But there was nothing ideological about her judgments and nothing mechanistic or cookie cutter about the poems she published. She wanted her poets to engage the tradition and to use the tools of that tradition to delight her readers. After that, as she always insisted, there were no rules and no taboos. That was her refrain. No rules, no taboos. I published several poems in Plains Poetry Journal when she reigned as its editor and monarch. Maybe half of them were in traditional forms, but one was out and out free verse, and the others were in forms I had made up. Jane was like the fictional Pope Ron, the first American pope, who was cooked up by Fran Lebowitz back in the 1980s. Pope Ron's motto, which he had on his t-shirt, was infallible, but not inflexible. Jane was infallible, but not inflexible. She went dark not many years after we began our correspondence, and the blackout was fairly total. She and Jim had adopted a child, and she decided she needed to give this particular child her full attention. She shut down the magazine. She ended her regular column in Chronicles magazine. And she later testified to me that in the 20-odd years that followed, she didn't write or even think a line of a poem or even a portion of a line. She shut off the switch. I tell you the following story so that you'll know the kind of stalker I am. Well, the years went by, and I missed Jane's poems. I owned a copy of her first collection, which is a limited edition thing, and I stuffed its pages with loose sheets. They're still stuffed with loose sheets clipped from odd magazines where she appeared when she was still writing. One night, I can tell you from digital records that it was March 4th, 2009. I was up and sleepless with the flu. I started Googling my interests and curiosities because I didn't have the brain power to do anything else. And at some point I decided to wield the mighty power of Google against Jane's self-imposed darkness. I would track her down, and I would extract from her whatever loose poems I had somehow missed. I found nothing, till an undeveloped stub entry turned up from LinkedIn. And it yielded an email address. I got her! So I wrote to the address and asked if this was indeed the poet Jane Greer. She said yes, and she actually remembered my name. So to Jane, I wasn't some random stalker. I was a specific, known, and recognized stalker. Jane told me that she was just beginning chemotherapy at the time, after breast cancer. She had downtime, and I consumed that downtime as much as I could. We caught up, and we kept catching up in the years that followed, in frequent emails and then Facebook messages, once she and my son conspired to drag me onto social media for the first time. I was a late adopter. She herself became a reason to stay on social media. It was right for her voice, her brevity, clarity, and bluntness, and her humor. She flourished on social media. People loved her posts. Once the heart emoticon became available, they used it on Jane's posts, and they loved Jane. She told me repeatedly that she didn't miss what she called the poet's bipolar life of mountainous bliss and bottomless valleys of despair. She didn't miss it at all. And I had to accept that. My relationship with Jane and Jim was entirely epistolary for a few years until the day, in 2011, I believe, maybe earlier, that I met them incarnate in Rome, of all places, and we spent a glorious week together, enduring forced marches through the night streets with a zealous young priest who was a lot younger than we were, and he wanted us to see everything. I remember Jane at one point, we're going down yet another side street, and he said, it's just 5 minutes out of the way, and we've been through this already many times that evening, and she said, I used to pray for you, I curse you. And after that, we met, it seems, alternatively in Rome and Bismarck. You know, the two poles on Earth, Rome and Bismarck, North Dakota, where I'd go to speak at the University of Mary. Many of you know that poetry returned to Jane very suddenly one night as she sat in a bar in New Orleans. After 20 years, the muse returned and never left her again. She produced 3 collections in the few years that followed, and they're magnificent. And in 2022, shortly after breaking her femur, Jane made her great triumphal march through Pittsburgh and Minnesota, giving 5 readings in just a few days. Ever afterward, she referred to this city, Pittsburgh, as the poetry capital of the world. Knowing that she's infallible, if not inflexible, I adopted that title immediately and have taught others to do so. For that reason and so many others, I'm delighted to be here tonight to enjoy a program that Jane herself lovingly planned, listening to the poets she herself chose from all the poets in the world. These are the poets she wanted to have this fantasy conversation with. Zina is taking Jane's place, so we're not going to put too much pressure on her after this introduction. But anyway, for that reason, so many others, I'm delighted to be here. The Oxford poet A.E. Stallings recently wrote, "Jane Greer left us too soon, but left us her wry, hard-won, well-wrought verses, witty and wise, that search for and find grace in unlikely places, like Pittsburgh." Thank you.
Just going to get my stuff up over here. It's so wonderful to be here at the poetry capital of the world. It is so great. Thank you so much, Mike. That was so wonderful. Thank you to James, Susan, and Abby at the Beatrice Institute for organizing this wonderful event. And it is a pleasure to be here with Bob and David, and especially Mr. W. I was so hoping that he would be here today, and this has just been a dream come true. And of course, as Mike said, Jane is here in spirit, and she's embedded in the details and the date that she selected and the poets she chose to read with. She planned so much and was looking forward to this evening. And I can't help but imagine her surprise that I'm the person speaking here tonight, and I can hear her voice right now saying, "Why Zina? What happened?" And honestly, up until today, I was asking myself the same question, because it really could have been anyone else who knew Jane, who knew her for a long time, who had met her in real life, any of the poets who had contributed to Jane's tribute in the New Verse Review. They could be doing what I'm doing right now. Esteemed writers like Sally Thomas, Amy Juster, Marley Yeomans, Ryan Wilson, Angela Lima O'Donnell. There are so many poets who knew Jane and loved her work. However, I think I represent precisely the type of person whom Jane connected with the greatest frequency. The social media doom scroller who didn't know how to write poetry, if they liked poetry, or those who liked poetry but could stand to like it even more. And, Jane lured us onto her Twitter and Facebook feeds with funny dog memes, and then surreptitiously educated us on the life and work of Josephine Jacobson. She would announce when she would have one of her poems published, when she was interviewed, and she was really vocal when she loved a poet's work, as was the case with David and his collection. She was a joy to watch in online readings, and she was always willing to answer questions at the end of those. And occasionally she would get into online arguments about what poetry is and what it isn't, like microsonnets, erasure poetry, free verse. Her opinions about this could be summed up in the quote that Mike had mentioned. Through history, the best poetry has used certain conventions: meter, rhyme, alliteration, assonance, painstaking attention to diction. Not all good poems use all of these conventions, but if a poem uses none of them, why call it a poem? After Jane died, it became apparent that there are so many people like me, appreciators of poetry, who read more than they wrote. Although we would never meet in real life, she became a guide, a mentor, a friend to me, and to others who were trying their luck with formal verse. She gave us encouragement, and when we asked, very bravely, for feedback. But she didn't just give. She enjoyed what we offered. And it wasn't just poetry, it was whatever we chose for our craft. Pictures of our baking, painting, photography, storytelling. She loved it all. When I was going through the tribute that we had published for New Verse Review, I was looking for one that kind of represented, something that was really unique about her. And this is from Noran Val. And she writes, since July 2025, when we heard of the unexpected passing of Jane Greer, I've been grieving the tremendous loss of such a dear friend. I never met Jane in person, but she cheered me on, publicly and privately, for over a decade. We met on Twitter in 2015, and since then, there was hardly a post she didn't comment on or consider. In 2023, she messaged me, Noran, this is just for you and Chris, not yet for sharing. And it might change, but this is what I have. It's her poem, 4 Perfect Figs. Because she spies them on the tree, because she knows he loves them, she plucks and lays them on his desk when he is out of the room. The solid facts of the world are war, pestilence, fear, and war. Yet no less solid is the fact of perfect figs laid there. And this is Noran saying, I wrote her back saying that I loved it and that she had my permission to share it when she was ready. She responded with, your tweets practically wrote it for me. After Jane died, I looked through our direct messages, thinking them to be myriad. What I realized was that no, we hadn't messaged that much, but she had commented, sometimes extensively, and often with many additions to the conversation, on almost every single post of mine. This is what created the bond of friendship, her authentically showing up on a daily basis with humor and grace and more humor. And so that was Noran, and this represents so much of other people, and including my own experience with Jane. When I found out that she passed away the very next day, I was on vacation with my kids and my husband, and it was just truly devastating. I never could imagine a world without her. And So I texted Steve Knepper, the editor of New Verse Review, and I said, wouldn't it be great if we had a tribute edition to Jane? And he said, that's a great idea. And there was silence. And then I realized, oh, I'm doing a tribute to Jane Greer. And at that moment, I was going, well, who do I ask? What do I do? And so I asked my friends, and my friend said, did you talk to Mike Aquilina? And I said, no, I guess I better. And then I asked Mike, and he just gave me a list of names, and that's who made up much of who are in that tribute issue. And so thank you so much, Mike, for putting me in contact with so many wonderful, established poets, friends of Jane, most of whom had not met her or met her once and briefly. And so this is a testament to Jane and also proof that, contrary to what we've been told, that social media is really truly social, because Jane is living proof that not only could you exist and make friendships online, but it creates this huge network that really is soul flourishing. And so, it's so shocking to me how much Jane has influenced my life and how much she has cheered me on. And she always loved to hear stories about my kids. And here's an example of one that she absolutely loved. I have 5 children, and our youngest one is pretty fiery. One day, she got mad at one of her older siblings, and she stood up in our living room and she yelled, "Don't you misunderjudge me!" And can you imagine Jane's response to this? I'm pretty sure she said, "That's the best word. That's all the words in one word." And it is. It's underestimate, misunderstands, it's judge. And thus, the title of my speech should really be known as Jane Greer, the most misunderjudged poet of the 21st century. In a literary world still dominated by fevers, she was judged for her adherence to meter. People misunderstood and mistook her argumentativeness for meanness. They underestimated her as a poet, since as a critic and editor, she spent so much time promoting others. She was underappreciated for her mastery and should have been more well-known. And in July of last year, we did for her what she had done for so many others. We promoted her. We said her poems out loud and shared them widely, and we loved her in that way. Just take a look at one of the last poems she ever published, which was in New Verse Review. It's called "In None of Her Other Ages." In none of her other ages had she noted her age, or its burden and bounty of expectations. The future was as flexible as the past. And in between, moments like unstrung pearls strewn across velvet, grieved and gladdened her, and always astonished her with their perfection. There was no nothingness. There was only being. Slowly she wakes from what seemed a dream to realize that this is her final age of indeterminate length and quality. Things are ending, or have ended, or will end. The pearls are strung with care. It is quite clear. There is no nothingness, but she can almost, some days, picture the world without her in it. At 14 lines, this could be considered a sonnet. It is, but it's no ordinary sonnet. It has 2 stanzas of 7 lines written in blank verse, meaning it doesn't rhyme. She uses metrical substitutions and elision, but she also doesn't seem to adhere puritanically to the meter. There's a jazzy, syncopated rhythm to this poem. And although this is mostly in pentameter, there are 2 notable lines of hexameter. There was no nothingness. There is only being. Things are ending, or have ended, or will end. She knew that by breaking the metrical contract there, those lines would stand out and bear the emotional weight of this poem. If you read through sonnets, you realize how many are concerned with time and a person's relationship with their time on earth, the value of what they have done. Think of some of the most famous poems that begin with when in disgrace and fortune in men's eyes, when I consider how my life is spent. This is also a sonnet concerned with when. There is no nothingness is the phrase that is repeated, and that is right. You can't create ex nihilo. All things come from God. The world goes on over the prairies and deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. One can picture the world without the ones we love, or even without ourselves. But the ones we love are always still with us. There is no nothingness. There is only being. And that is where she is. Jane is in a constant state of being, in the perpetual light of God's love. Thank you. And so now, I guess we are in our next phase of talking about poetry and also about Jane. Now, one of the things I don't have, I realize, is a bio for everybody. So if you want to introduce who you are, starting with David and go down the line.
I think it's on.
Yeah.
I'm George David Clark. I teach very near to here. I live in Peters Township and teach at Washington and Jefferson College. And I think I probably know Jane the least out of everyone up here at the table. I met Jane for the first time via email last summer. She sent me an email when she was just beginning to think about putting this event together and asked me to be a part of it. And I had no idea who Jane was. And I'm realizing, just hearing Mike talk up here, and hearing you talk, Zina, about how little I've learned of who Jane is through reading her poems. I've been reading her poems for the past year now, and getting to know her through the many voices that she has on the page. And I'm realizing that some of what I thought was Jane, and some things that I thought were poems in persona were also maybe Jane. Just the North Dakota Jane that you were talking about earlier, Mike. And I'm thinking that poem that we mentioned earlier, Bob Trending. I thought this was a poem in persona, and I still think it is. It is to some extent. But the real Jane's in there, maybe more than I realized. I didn't know Jane's personality on Twitter and didn't have that relationship with her. And so I think maybe I'm like a lot of you who might not have connected with Jane before tonight, but maybe I'm just like a year ahead of you in terms of reading her poems and her books. And it's been a delight to get to know her on the page, and I feel like I really missed out on getting to know Jane while she was with us, even just doing so virtually through Twitter or something like that.
David is also the editor of 32 Poems, which is one of the best journals going today, so you should know that. And he did 2 collections, right? And they're both wonderful, so check them out. I'm Mike Aquilina. I already told you all about myself, so I'm just going to pass this on to Bob.
Thank you. I had the great fortune of meeting Jane later in her life. I don't have the long and storied history that Mike has with Jane. But Robert Frost has a great title of a poem, "Happiness Makes Up in Height for What It Lacks in Length." And I think about my relationship with Jane that way, because we had a wonderful, sort of intense relationship, even though it was only short-lived. And I was fortunate enough to be invited by James to read with Jane and Sam Hazo a couple years ago here. And that event was such a great event. I loved it. It was one of the highlights of the last decade for me. And so Jane and I corresponded fairly frequently, and I want to read some excerpts from what she wrote to me when we were thinking about this event. So here's the wacky idea I have for a poetry reading or two. Please give feedback. I thought of some downsides, and there must be more. Or why wouldn't what I'm about to describe be the norm? There would be 2 to 3 poets who would take turns reading a poem, or a couple of short poems. A poem might be a response to the poem just read, or it might set it off in a completely different direction. No one, neither the audience nor the other poets, would know which poem was coming. And then she says, the point of the evening would be to celebrate poetry, all caps, by engaging the audience with something more visually interesting, all caps, and orally diversified, all caps, than one poet reading for an hour. The audience would see poets come and go from the lectern. They would also see enjoyment and play among the poets. Thoughts? And I said, I love it. It's all about the joy of language and hearing it and rolling the poem in your mouth. It's a celebration of poetry, not poets. The joy, all caps, not the stuffiness. And then I said, yes, nothing worse than being caught in the black hole of poet speak. And those of you who know what I'm talking about know that that black hole is inescapable sometimes. And then Jane says, intoning one's poem. Puke emoji. Let's play. So let's play tonight and have a good time. Okay.
I should probably introduce myself too. So my name is Zina Gomez-Liss. I'm the deputy editor of New Verse Review, also the one who edited the tribute to Jane Greer, which I guess is what put me on the map with Mike. And I'm also a graduate student at the University of St. Thomas in Houston. It's a remote program, and I've been there for a couple of years, and I study with James Matthew Wilson and Ryan Wilson. And Ryan Wilson was a great friend of Jane's and published, he had published Old Dog, which is a wonderful poem. So, and that was in Literary Matters. So Ryan was the editor of Literary Matters for about 7 years. And so I know that that was one of the poems that you wanted to read out.
Thank you. So this is called Old Dog. Of course, I gravitated to this poem because I'm a dog lover. I own 2 dogs. My son and his girlfriend, who are here, own a wonderful dog, and we get our dogs together. This is the poem. Her food and water live across the room. She has a thought. She lifts her nose. She measures and weighs effort and risk. Her hungers bloom, the long, slick floor between her and her pleasures. And then decides. Long stretches, fore then hind, and she sets off, her stiff legs under control. Eyes on the prize, just one thing on her mind, listing only slightly, she reaches the goal and then just stands there, rueful and perplexed, inches from paradise without a clue. She sits, she stares at the wall, not sure what's next, how she has come there, what she had meant to do. It's a lovely poem. I mean, the poem begins, of course, with a very literal description of an old dog. And you think you're reading about an old dog, and then suddenly the whole poem turns on that word paradise. And you realize that this isn't a poem about a dog. This is a poem about us as we age and we lose our faculties and we're contemplating the greatest mystery of what comes next after our decline. And so one of the things that I love about Jane's metaphysical leaps in her poems is that sometimes there's a surety, but also oftentimes there's a kind of doubt, a sort of metaphysical doubt, where she recognizes that the great mysteries of the divine are inscrutable in this life. And she acknowledges that. And so when I read this poem, not only because of its impeccable craft, it's, Robert Frost says, a poem must move easily in its harnesses. The form and the rhyme do not call attention to themselves in any way. The rhymes move gracefully through the argument of the poem. So there's nothing extraneous or inauthentic about her description of this dog. And so it's the kind of figurative poem that I love in Jane's work, where there's always a literal meaning that you can enter on even the most rudimentary level, but then there's also the figuration, the metaphorical possibility that enables us to learn and see something more. The poem is a demonstration for a much larger abstract idea. And that's the joy of Jane's poems.
I love what you said, Bob, about the really surprising places that Jane can go in a poem. That you might be pointed in one direction and then you realize the poem's doing 2 or 3 other things that catch you off guard and that sometimes set you ill at ease. I mentioned my fondness for her poems in persona earlier. And I think maybe I'll read one of those that I think captures something about who Jane was, at least the Jane that I've come to know from the poems. That she writes many poems in persona, often in the voices of biblical figures. And the moments that she chooses to capture are often the moments where, not like the moments of euphoria, right? So it's not David singing in the streets, but it's David like right before Bathsheba, angry at God. Like that, the conflict with God seems to be that one of the richest points of engagement for Jane. I'll share a poem I really admire that's in the voice of King David. The title is He Paces. There is a line. To cross the line is sin. To want to cross the line is sin. To ache for the line to never have been dreamed or drawn, that too is sin. It is a grave mistake to wish you different, Lord, and sin is death. But she is my heart's hot core, my slumber's wreck, my ruin, my rapture and my ragged breath, my deepest wound, my own self, halved and healed, the cataclysm and the aftermath, all your whirling firmament revealed, fruit and fruition I cannot live without, glad homecoming for one too long exiled. And you, what were you trying to bring about, placing her naked there in front of me when you had drawn the line? Lord, do you gloat at your servant all unstrung, Your treachery stings. Why am I teased and then denied? I whom you anointed when I was a boy. Am I to consider your line some great divide? I could cross over in a single stride. That's good as it gets angry at God and threatens God, and then of course you know the story. It's not like we end in a happy place and like things get fixed. Like David threatens it, and then we end the poem knowing he's going to do it. So it's a heartbreaker. Yeah.
But the celebration of desire in the poem in the middle of the poem is amazing, isn't it? We're extolling the virtues of the beloved. I mean, oh my God.
More space gets given to the line in the poem, right? And yet it doesn't stand any chance against the description of the beloved's beauty.
Incredible. It's great.
As I said earlier, Jane was a formalist and a regionalist, and she was very proud of living in North Dakota. I had never been to North Dakota before. I didn't know what North Dakota was, really. I didn't know until Jane told me, and then showed me when I was out there, that in North Dakota, it's about 30 below zero for 350 days of the year. And then for the other 15 or 16, it's 109. She loved this. She loved it. I thought it was like visiting Mars. It really was. I didn't know that tumbleweed was something real. I thought it was just in cowboy songs, right? The tumbling tumbleweed, right? But when I went out there, I'd be with Jane and Jim, and we'd go out to the parking lot, and the first thing you did was look under the car, and you'd kick out the tumbleweed, right? That's what you did. I thought this was the craziest thing. Jane loved the plains. She loved North Dakota. And I love this poem that she wrote that's kind of a love poem to her state. And of course it's called -97. Cold enough to freeze the balls off a pool table. The temp falls. Wind chill factor kicks in hard. Dog squats before she hits the yard. Keeps out the riffraff, our t-shirts say. Who dreamed up wind chill anyway? Any ass out in all this weather deserves 3 toes and skin like leather. We snowmobile to jobs and bars, let our taps drip, plug in our cars, bundle our kids till they can't bend over, curl up with Jim Beam and Russell Stover. All of this and the cold still winds. We're being punished for our sins. Puff the dour preacher, stiff with fear. Well, Armageddon out of here. That's just Jane's voice. That's Jane's voice. You can hear the roar in the last line, which I can't do. The Armageddon out of here. She loved her state and she loved the roughness of it. Keeps the riffraff out.
Okay, so there is a great video of Jane reading this poem, Bourbon Neat. And when, I think it was the last Frost Farm, it was after she had passed away, I was renting a house, and a bunch of us, Carla Galdo, Sally Thomas, and I took out a bottle of bourbon and toasted Jane. And so I always think about this poem now very fondly. So here it is, Bourbon Neat. Thin to a filament of fire and fall, web of hot wire down my dark veins, to bundle me in my black root hollow. What heat you lose, such heart I gain. Such heart I gain, pale amber swallow. Kindles the bone where you coil and hiss. Whose supple lover on the silk pillow seizes the blood in a blaze like this? It's a wonderful Do you guys have any other ones? Because if you don't, I have a.
Yeah, maybe I'll share another one.
Oh, yeah.
I'll do it real quick. Well, I think my daughter just stepped out to go to the restroom or something. You didn't do me any good today, Zina, talking about the greatness of social media in connecting. My daughter's 13 years old and wants desperately to get some social media on her telephone. Yeah, you didn't do me any favors. She was looking right at me when you were saying that. So this is that poem we were talking about earlier, that's the trending poem. I'll try this one. Trending. I check my feed from bed first thing each morning and find today that overnight I've shot to new heights of approval with no warning. It's hard to know which of my bon mots caught the world's imagination. And no matter, genius rules and cream will always rise to the top. I love how total strangers' chatter builds exponentially before my eyes. I dazzle them. Their thumbs tap approbation faster and faster into the hungry void. The likes blow up, numeric affirmation of my whole life so brilliantly employed. I'm the hottest fashion of the season. I'm where I was always meant to be, the focus of all worship and all reason. Swift and astral my ascendancy. By afternoon, some wit or politician will seize my ranking. Triggered and dismissed, I'll nonetheless intensify my mission. When I'm not trending, I do not exist.
That really happened. That really happened. She went viral and she was loving it. She was texting me saying, guess how many now? Guess how many now? She was like, loving this, loving this, loving this. And she wrote that the next day. It was real.
Well, I mean, I have a question then for you guys, because I think there's this tension between being a poet and also using the technology that is available right now, whether it be AI, whether it be social media, whatever it is. But Jane had really embraced these different platforms, and then not only that, but I mean, one of the reasons why I think I became more active was because there were Substackers that were wanting to interview her, so they would host, readings, and I remember being in one of those Substack, Zoom room things, and holding up her books in my little corner and showing the one that she was reading out of. And that absolutely delighted her. I mean, she just loved that. And she was always so surprised when, you would text her and say, I read your poem at this event. And she'd go, oh, that's so wonderful. And you just act so incredibly grateful, though, too. I was wondering what your experiences are. And I feel like they're very different because I can tell, David, you don't have that much of a social media presence, but you do have an online journal that you do need to promote. I mean, how do you use technology and try to generate this love for poetry that obviously Jane had?
I'm not very good at it. So my wife does most of our social media stuff, so pretty much everything that you see 32 Poems doing online, the credit goes to Elizabeth for that. Sometimes I'll draft a post or something, if there's something that we need to share, and I might send it to her and ask her if she will improve upon it and send it around, that sort of thing. But yeah, social media drains me, and I really have a hard time spending any amount of time on Facebook or Twitter or others.
Yeah.
And I know that's not a good thing. That doesn't help. It makes things harder for our magazine, and a lot of sacrifice as a result of that. But personally, it's just hard for me to do it.
Yeah, and then of course there's also your own personal poetry too, and how do you promote yourself? Because doesn't that make you more attractive to publishers? Like if you're looking to get another book printed as well. I mean, do you know of any other poets that that promote themselves really well?
Yeah, I think there are many who do an excellent job at it, and who can do it without seeming narcissistic, or they can host a conversation on their social media that isn't just about them, but also gives them a vehicle to share what's going on in their writing life. Yeah, I wish I had that skill.
Yeah. I think Jane was really successful at this because she had such a great sense of humor. And not only that, but I was like looking back at her Twitter feed and her Facebook feed, and a lot of it has nothing to do with poetry. Like I said, like she would like lure you with these memes, and then you'd see all these other links to poetry, and so then you just click on it. But she always made it so much fun. And I think out of the four of us, Mike, you knew her the best. How long have you known her?
I think since the late 80s, maybe? I don't know. That's what I think, anyway. It goes back about that far. Yeah. It was her humor. And her humor was so wonderful. And she did have a self-deprecating way of putting her poems out there. Anyway, he mentioned the David and Bathsheba poem. And David and Bathsheba are, of course, the subject of the title poem of her first collection, which is Bathsheba on the Third Day. Bathsheba on the Third Day. So I'm gonna read that poem. Hot, hot, hot is all those spooky crows can think to say. We ought to have some people over, take in a funny show, redecorate this tent. Aren't you listening, lover? We'll just have to invent our own fun. Take a course, maybe, in the fall, and then, oh, please, babe, not again. We never talk anymore. Great stuff. So that's the flip side of the poem that David read. That's a punishment.
I was going to say David did.
David has some really wonderfully funny poems too, so I'm hoping you might read one of those that I mentioned earlier today, kind of along those lines, even a little more extended. So it's really funny. But I love this picture that Jen took for the last book. So just piggybacking on what you were asking about social media. Here's Jane, sitting in front of her window and staring out at her beloved North Dakota. And you can imagine being a captive to the North Dakota winter. There are not too many places to go. And, imagine how confining Emily Dickinson's room was in Amherst, where she spent almost all of her time in her house, upstairs, sending down baked goods via a basket to little neighborhood children, but not interacting physically with the people around her. So she relied on letters, and she relied on other forms of communication and poetry. And I think about Emily Dickinson's letters being the great technology of the day that enabled her to connect with a world outside the confines of her own limited spaces. And I think about Jane in the same way. Now, I agree with your parents. What's your daughter's name? Gemma. Social media is toxic, stay away. But there are ways for you to connect socially with a wide network. Letters, yes. With a wide network of connections and a matrix of connections that enabled Jane to extend her life far beyond North Dakota. And, Emily Dickinson has that great line, the brain is wider than the sky. Well, the skies in North Dakota are huge. I mean, you see skyscapes and landscapes because there's no foliage. And when I think about Jane's imagination and the quality of her humor. In order to exceed the sky in North Dakota, your imagination has to be profound. And that's how I think about Jane, and that's how I think about social media, and her willingness to extend herself out, to bring people in, and the great wit and humor, and as David was saying, self-deprecation, that she always displayed. I mean, the last thing that Jane would have wanted was for us to sit up here and talk about her poetry. I'm pretty sure that she would be very embarrassed by this, but we can't help it because we loved it.
I think that she was able to use social media really well because she knew who she was. She had a strong position. She had a good sense of humor. She didn't take herself too seriously, but she took the craft seriously. And I think that's how a lot of poets need to survive, and you develop that, because part of being a poet is getting those pink slips. You know, maybe not quite literally, but getting all those rejections and not having it, you know, tied to your ego as well. So, yeah, and so I guess you kind of have to develop some type of self-deprecation, you know, in order to like be friends with each other too, because she was just such a wonderful friend. There was no competition. I mean, she never seemed like she was competing with anybody. And sometimes, if you meet a whole bunch of, you know, different types of poets, there can be a bit of competition there, because you start thinking, well, they, why did they get into this journal and I submitted my stuff there? You want to do a good job, and one of the ways that you feel like you are is by getting published. And, you know, I was wondering, though, too, because I know that two of you here are academics, and you have students, and how do you nurture those poets and help them deal with this sense of knowing yourself as a writer? Like, how do you develop that sense of voice and also a confidence of what your style is? And then also helping them understand that, yes, you're going to get rejected a lot.
That's a great question. And you being a student now know what that is like. There's a fine line between destroying one's confidence and being an honest assessor of work. I mean, there's a lot of poetry out there that is, there's a lot of bad poetry out there. There's a lot of nepotism in the poetry world where friends are publishing friends' works and friends are reviewing friends' poetry. And sometimes the friendship exceeds the quality of the poetry itself. And I understand that. I mean, in some ways, that's always been the case. But I think your first obligation as a teacher is to reveal that this is a difficult mug's game. And you've got to develop a thick skin. So for any of you young writers who are just starting out, persistence, perfection of your craft, and dogged determination to improve because you're receiving honest feedback is essential. I had the great fortune of studying with a wonderful poet named Donald Justice and another poet at the University of Florida named William Logan. William Logan had the moniker of the most hated man in American poetry. And I can remember submitting a poem to his workshop, and he wrote a single comment on the end of the poem, He said, "The end of this poem is so drenched in false pathos that it has the effect of a tranquilizing dart." So, you know, of course, it stung. You know, when you get that kind of a comment and you think, I'm going back to the steel mill, right? But then, you know, you learn, you take that advice to heart, and you start improving. So even though I didn't like that comment at the time, I recognized when I let that comment rest for a while that he was absolutely right. Now, I don't think I would ever express my discontent with a student's poem with that kind of phrasing, but I will suggest where poems are failing, where I think they're working, and where I think those poems must go. Because, as you were saying, it's not about the quality of one's vanity or ego, it's about the quality of the poem. And you've got to learn how to separate yourself from the text. You have to be both inside and outside of the text simultaneously. And until you develop your own sense of critical acumen, I don't think you're going to improve as a writer. And now, I want feedback. I want people to be hard on my poems. I want to hear what they really think. So I'm going to hand that off.
Yeah, maybe I'll tell a Donald Justice story.
Oh,
Right,
okay.
so you were a student of Donald Justice's. I did not know that.
Yeah.
That is so cool. There's maybe you've heard of the story before, and you can tell me if it's apocryphal or it's, you know. Donald Justice is a student of John Berryman's, and this is like the first semester that he's been in Berryman's class, and Berryman's been hard on everybody's poems, maybe not hard in the kind of mean way that William Logan could be sometimes, right? William Logan, everything he says, I'm pretty much persuaded by it, right? It does seem accurate. But sometimes he enjoys the joke that he's making at the poet's expense so much that it's hard to hear the truth of what he's saying. But, so that's been going on in the Berryman workshop apparently up to this point. And Donald Justice brings in a poem called The Wall, fabulous sonnet. And the story is that they sit down to workshop this poem, and Berryman just reads the poem aloud in front of the other students and says, "This is a real poem, and no teacher has the right to expect this to be turned into their workshop. So let's read it one more time, and then class is canceled for the rest of the day." And that also is probably the wrong move to make, and that might say more about John Berryman than it says about the greatness of this great poem. But I think the other side is that you need to tell your students the truth. You don't have to tell them the truth about every line, right? But tell them that a couple of hard truths, but also enthusiastically praise the moments where they nail it, right? And even if it's just, you know, half a line, a lot of my commentary is about what's going right in that one line. And then there's got to be the truth too.
Exactly. There's nothing ever completely bad about a poem because they felt strongly enough to compose it. So just the impulse almost automatically creates something worthy of working with, I think, you know. And if you're not going to, you know, get a table out of this poem, maybe you'll get a chair. And if maybe you don't get a chair out of this poem, maybe you'll get a stool. You know, there's something worth looking at in every student's poem. And you brought up the question of voice, which is a very interesting question. And, you know, there are a lot of poetry teachers out there who are of the opinion that you should write like me, only not quite so well because you're competing against me for the same journal space, right? And I am very suspicious of that because I want students to begin cultivating their own sense of style. But I want them to cultivate a style, right? What sort of linguistic signatures are going to differentiate your poem from everyone else's poem? And that's a really interesting problem that you have to solve. You know, if you look at a lot of contemporary poetry, if you remove the author's name from the poem and you were asked to identify the poet, you wouldn't be able to because there are so many poets who sound so much like every other poet. And the poets that I revere and like the most are those poets who have very self-consciously developed a voice and a style. Doesn't mean that they have to remain in that voice throughout their career, but I think it's important for you to do that. And so how can I, as a teacher, recognize those linguistic signatures and try to guide them to models who are working within the tradition that they seem to be gravitating toward? So I think there are different lineages of poets and poetry, and if you're well enough read and you're open-minded enough to enjoy all kinds of forms and styles of poetry, then you can usually direct a student to a particular set of poems that can show them how to resolve certain problems.
Oh, that sounds great. So, in thinking about Jane's voice, how would you describe that? And can you think of any particular poem of hers that kind of encapsulates that? Or is it, there was the persona poem. She likes to take those on. But I was wondering if there are any other poems that come to mind.
I mean, the poems in this last collection have a little different tenor to them than a lot of the jokey, witty, wry poems. There's more meditation on mortality that kind of brutally doesn't let up in some of the later poems. And there's one of those that I thought maybe I'd read that it's not. I don't think it's a poem that sums up Jane's voice, but maybe it's one of her valences that we haven't tried yet. This is the last warm Saturday. The last warm Saturday, the final mowing, that drone, that fragrance, with the traitor sun low-angled, making all this not quite right. Here is a bitter yearly winnowing of what's to come from what it's in decline, parsed in the language of the changing light. I know this language, but I cannot speak it. I learned it from my senses over time. It comforts me. It makes me cold and mute. In trying to express its deepest secret, all I can mumble is its paradigm, that loss and bliss come from the same root. Something about it comforts me and makes me cold and mute is like this deeply Jane to me. And maybe this is the North Dakota thing again, right? I'm comforted and chilled to the bone by this thing at the same time, and her ability to capture that paradox that seems like a uniquely Jane quality to these poems.
Yeah, that doubleness in the poems. Loss and bliss, not only the rhyme, but also the antithesis being yoked together, right? It's all part of the same experience. I think it's one of her signature moves in poems.
She wanted you guys to read your poems, and I'd like you to read your back poem, because she loves that poem.
Okay. All right. Well, I've been talking a lot. How about some of you?
Go ahead.
See, okay. I don't want to dominate anything here. I feel like I need to just be quiet for a minute. I wrote this poem for Alicia Stallings, or I dedicated it to Alicia Stallings, whom Mike mentioned had blurred the back of Jane's book. She's a wonderful poet. She holds the Oxford Chair in Poetry now, which is a storied position in the history of poetry. And she's a very good formal poet, and she knew Jane's work and loved Jane's work as well. And she gave this wonderful lecture as part of her tenure as Oxford poet, and she talked about echolocation in bats. And so I kind of played off some of the ideas in that lecture. I love to fly fish. I love small brown bats. When I was younger, whenever I would fly fish in the evening, the bats would spill out of the trees and in the caves, and I would see thousands of bats above the streams where I would fly fish. And unfortunately, because of white nose syndrome, which is a fungus that has really decimated little brown bat populations, their numbers have declined precipitously. And so I thought I needed to celebrate the bat and, sort of honor the quality of Alicia's lecture by responding to it with a poem. So it goes like this. The bat observes the world mostly upside down, and clinging fast to branch or ledge, lays heaven at its feet, hell at its head, its smiling face inverted into frown. In darker tales, such piercing eyes and fangs made mockery of our mortality. For 2 small drops of blood, how easily so many sold their souls. But this one hangs until a different hunger bids it fly. With wings too weak to launch such heaviness, it has no other choice but to release its grasp on airy height and so defy the stones below. Unfurling its tucked wings and spreading wide those strong, adapted hands, it drops toward earth, risking rising land, then gaining speed and lift, begins to sing. O Felix culpa. The ordered world set right, the smile returns, as if its sonar calling, or joyful praise for signatures of flight, or gentler hands that fashion all this falling. So,
I'm not sure I want to hear any. Yeah, no, this is awesome. I love that when you make that term, Felix culpa, the fortunate fall, and how bats, in order to fly, they need to drop, but that creates that grace of flight, that beauty. I love that poem. I didn't realize that was such a new poem, because that lecture was not that long ago. That was her Randall Jarrell back poem. And so that's, what, a couple years old?
I'm sure you guys know her poem about bats too, explaining an affinity for bats.
Yeah.
There's the great line about the octave is all about how she loves bats for the way that they, I guess it's the way they fly. It's the interesting movement, the pirouettes they do in the air, and then the sestet is the way that they sing, right? They found out they throw their language into darkness, and they attend to the way that the words, the sounds, bounce back at them. They figure out what the world is by throwing their language out into the world. Yeah.
That's a great poem and a great lecture.
When Bob gave a reading at the Carnegie a year and a half ago, maybe, thereabouts. So when he read that poem there, and some of you here will know Father Joe Freedy, who's a great preacher. And Father Joe Freedy was at his reading, and I ran into him as I was leaving, and he had this big smile on his face, and he said, "Bats have to fall in order to fly. Bats have to fall in order to fly." And I said to him, "I can predict right now your next 10 homilies."
Oh, that's wonderful. When I was reading one of the emails that James had sent to us, I think Jane said something about kind of poems that were in the womb, or that were new, that we hadn't published yet, and that maybe we could, you know, recite them or whatever. I mean, I don't know whether or not you guys have that, but I actually have one that I haven't sent out or anything. It's about
Yeah.
a month old. But it actually is somewhat inspired by Newly Not Eternal, which is David's book. And it's good to not explain a poem and just let the poem speak for itself. And because it's new, I'm worried I don't remember it correctly, but I actually don't have it written down. So here we go. It's called Other Than Life. Adam was tasked with naming all the birds and beasts before the fall, before his banishment to earth to toil, for Eve to wail in birth. Of all the gifts, I think I know why God chose naming. It was so each could be seen, identified by size and hue and how it cried. Other than life, sometimes a name is all a mother has to claim that someone ever lived inside her womb. I know that you had died. You lived, but never drew a breath. You have no birthday, just a death. No one remembers. Seems a shame. I only have this gift, your name. Yeah, so anyway, what we're talking about over here is that if you have not gotten this book, there's a set of sonnets are in here. It's a half crown because you lost one of your twin sons and was stillborn, and it's an incredibly moving piece. It's a wonderful, wonderful book, and it's such a testament to fatherhood, to motherhood, to family. So, Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, so this is, we were expecting twins. Gemma's little brother, Peter, is 11, and he would have had a twin, Henry. I'll just read the first of the 7 sonnets. The series is ultrasound, and each one has a little subtitle. This is Ultrasound, Your Picture, and there's an epigraph for his name, Henry Thomas Clark, 10/7/14. We framed an ultrasound of you and Peter holding hands were almost in the womb. Your moon-bright arms crossed in a black balloon with week and weights and heights in millimeters penciled on the side. We say it's good that he at least was with you when you died, that unlike us, you'll never know the why of being lonely or what naked falsehood feels like in one's mind. You see its faults to say your death was somehow grace. It's grace that spared Cain's life and later gave Eve other sons despite creation's wastes and faults. I wish you could have known love's aftertastes. I wish you had a chance to hate your brother.
Can I just comment on both of those poems? I mean, this is what I want from poetry. I want this sorry, I was watching you as he was reading this poem. And, you're cracking yourselves wide open here, exposing the deepest intimacies of human joy and human suffering. And there's so much poetry that I see out there that doesn't do this. And Robert Frost, I'm sorry, I'm a Frost scholar, so I keep referring to Robert Frost. Robert Frost called this quality recognition, where people who are reading or hearing another poet's poems have to find something in their own lives that they can relate to. Frost says, the poet reminds them of something they remembered, something they did not know. I mean, it's an interesting phrase. And so when I think about this poem about miscarriage, and I think about this poem, and I think about the pain and the simultaneous joy and pain that you have to feel during the birth of your son who made it. And then I think about the way you go into that sort of mythical leap at the end of the poem, where you're thinking about fratricide, you know, one of the earliest sins in Genesis. And it's almost as if there's this comfort of knowing the brother in the womb, but also this sort of competition that's emerging that speaks to both the quality of human compassion and joy and the quality of human competition and envy simultaneously. It's a stunning poem. I mean, and your poem is stunning too, and I love the way that they just spoke to one another. You know, the intertextual quality of both of those poems is astonishing. So thank you for reading both of those poems. I just had to say that. Sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you to our panelists. Thank you for the poems you shared. And those of you, there's still wine in the back, there's still food, we still have the hall for a little bit while longer. Please refill your glasses, continue to chat, feel free to mob the poets. And don't forget that there are books for sale in the back. If you are interested in George David Clark's work, you can buy his work on his website, georgedavidclark.com. All right, so thank you again.